Hello and welcome to another video review. This is BioShock 2 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3, specifically the PC version. This review is coming to you courtesy of Sipho Fighter. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to the original BioShock, which was developed by Irrational Games and was released to a fair amount of acclaim. People generally liked it a fair amount, and even I liked it a fair amount up until it really got on my nerves with some of the gameplay mechanics and stuff like that. But again, that was by Irrational Games. This is the sequel developed by 2K Marin. And so it's kind of a weird circumstance when you go between these two games, because there is a very noticeable difference between them, even though they are set in the same location and everything. And this is the direct follow-up to BioShock. It takes place after the events of original BioShock in the same location, so it is actually a sequel, unlike BioShock Infinite, which is just in the same series, but it has really not that much to do with the original BioShock, except maybe the themes and stuff like that. So, the real question here is, how did 2K Marin handle the license? Did they improve on things? Did they make things worse? What actually happened with it? Well, as far as the visuals go, they really don't look any different from the original BioShock. In fact, most of the assets are reused. So it's kind of weird going from BioShock to BioShock 2. They have a very, very samey visual feel. Part of that is, of course, that it does take place in Rapture. But again, they've reused most of their assets, so you do see a lot of repeated stuff in here, and it really does give you that kind of deja vu thing. Now, I would understand why they would do that, and of course, it makes sense considering the setting and everything, and the fact that it only takes place about a year after the events of the original BioShock. But still, it's one of those things that just comes across as very samey. And that's even though I'm running this in DirectX 10 mode. It doesn't seem to look any different. I've got everything on the highest settings, and it doesn't look any different in BioShock 2 than it did in BioShock 1. And I don't really know why that is. Maybe there are some very subtle effects that I'm not noticing, but it doesn't seem to look any better. And it certainly doesn't run any better, though it doesn't run any worse, so that's a good thing. Though I did notice a few problems when I was switching between menus. Like I would hit the escape key and go to the pause menu so I could save my game, and it would take a good 10 to 20 seconds to load the menu. And then I would go to the save menu and take another 10 to 20 seconds to load that menu. And then sometimes even more than that. So I don't really know whether that was just because I was running in DirectX 10 mode, or whether it was Games Windows Live or whatever. But something caused this thing to load very slowly on the menus, and that does get very, very annoying. And it seemed to get worse the more I played the game, so that's something to keep in mind. I don't know if it's just an issue that I experienced or whether it's a pretty common thing, but it was kind of annoying as far as I'm talking about performance. But something that's not performance related but is also annoying about visuals in this game, the FOV is really low. I believe it's about 60, and for a PC game, you really can't do that. So there is a thing available online where you can look up a key binding that you can put into your INI file, and that will change your FOV to 90, or whatever you actually want it to be. But the problem with that is you have to do it every single time it does a cutscene, because for some reason it resets. So when it does major cutscenes and it loads new levels and stuff like that, you constantly have to keep hitting that FOV thing, and it does get pretty annoying after a while. So that's something else to keep in mind if you have problems with low FOV. As far as the sound design goes, it's kind of interesting because the voice acting is still pretty much top-notch. For the most part, the characters are well acted. The splicers sound certainly very crazy, and they're supposed to. But they just don't have the same oomph that the characters did in the original BioShock, and I'll get to that more later on. But they just don't have the same oomph, if that makes any sense. It's kind of hard to describe, but they just don't really affect you the kind of way the characters did in the original BioShock. They don't seem as solid as they were. But again, the voice acting is well done. The sound effects are also very well done. Certain weapons sound very beefy, certain ones don't. The environmental sound effects and such like that are still very well done for the most part. And the music is actually really well done for the most part. The main theme to BioShock 2 is actually this. If it were not in BioShock 2, and again I'll get to this in a moment, then it would actually be a pretty emotional piece. And if you just listen to it by itself, it's got a very nice sound to it. It's very forlorn, stuff like that. But it has the problem of being in BioShock 2. And when I get to the story and the gameplay, I'll elaborate more on this. But the music feels like it doesn't fit, even though it is really well done. So, enough ado. What about this story and gameplay that seems to bother me? The story itself is kind of odd because there's a time skip in there, but most of it takes place a year after the events of the original BioShock. The time skip is a decade before the events of BioShock 2. You see yourself, Subject Delta, who is the first successful Big Daddy, ends up basically shooting himself in the head by order of Sophia Lamb, so she can take his little sister away from him and go do her crazy stuff. And I don't want to spoil too much of the story, but suffice to say, the story ends up being you're basically looking for your little sister. And her name is Eleanor, and you end up finding all sorts of things about her that are just ridiculous. Like, she's special, and has this destiny, according to Sophia Lamb, who is clearly insane throughout the entirety of it. She's just mad with power. And the problem with this is not so much the story itself. The story itself is pretty simple for the most part, and it ends up not being all that interesting for the most part. Your decisions throughout the game of what you do with little sisters when you find them, as well as what you do to certain main antagonists throughout the game, does influence how the game ends. But other than that, there's really not much going for the storyline. It ends up being kind of simplistic, and you just go, this is no BioShock 1. So the problem isn't so much the story itself. If you took it as a game in itself, it'd just be a pretty weak storyline. But this is the sequel to BioShock, which had a pretty strong story for the most part, and it had a nice twist in it and stuff like that. This one doesn't, and it's just kind of there. And even worse, it kind of directly contradicts things that happened in the original BioShock, even though it does reference things like that. For instance, there's this whole conflict going on between Andrew Ryan and Sophia Lamb in the background, and leading up to the events that happened in BioShock 2. And you sit there going, why didn't I see any of this in the original BioShock? And you can't really answer that, because it's just sequel. It's retconned. And so there's a bunch of stuff in this game that is just blatantly retconned from BioShock 1. It's just, oh, suddenly this stuff's here, even though we're acting like it's been there for quite a while. And so ultimately, the story feels really out of place, and it just feels kind of slapped together to put it into a game. And that really is a problem as far as BioShock goes, because BioShock is pretty heavy on storyline as far as this series goes. So when you have a storyline that doesn't really go anywhere and feels very tacked on, and a cast of characters who aren't really all that interesting, and they don't really go anywhere, and you combine that with gameplay problems from the original BioShock, which are still there, although they did try to alleviate some of them. One of these big problems is the bullet sponge enemies. That just gets really boring after a while, if you know what I mean. Old school shooters used to do that, but you can really kind of cut them some slack, because again, they were old school. In this one, it seems like your 50 caliber machine gun, which is basically a minigun, or a chain gun, I should say, doesn't do all that much damage, even though it's firing 50 caliber rounds. It's basically a replacement for the Tommy gun from the original game. And that's just things you notice throughout the game with the gameplay. It's just things seem to replace things from the original BioShock, but functionally they're pretty much the same. And so that's kind of annoying. Now, they did add in a feature where you're basically dual wielding. You have a plasmid and your weapon at the same time. And your weapons range from, of course, the drill, which I actually didn't use all that much, to, of course, the rivet gun, this launcher thing, shotgun, which is actually a sawed-off double barrel now, the machine gun I mentioned, as well as eventually you get a spear gun, which is kind of overpowered as well. So it's things like that all of course blend together to make what should be a pretty interesting combat system, except that it devolves into tedium. And that's because the 1-2 punch from the original game still exists. The shock plasmid plus any weapon to a headshot. Instant kill, basically. Unless it's a really powerful enemy or something like that. And so combat never poses a challenge to you. Even though they act like it does, and it's like, oh, you need to use health kits, it throws them at you like candy. And even putting it on hard difficulty, it still throws this stuff at you like candy. Like, actually hacking machines and stuff now, you can get blue bonuses, and the hacking minigame is greatly simplified. It's just a basically timing thing. And if you hit the blue zone with the needle, then you get certain bonuses depending on what the machine is. Like, for instance, with health machines, it now drops first aid kits if you hit the blue zone with that, and it's pretty easy to do that. There's also things like if you go up to an ammo machine or something like that and you hit the blue zone, then it'll just drop ammo for you. And so, again, the game throws ammo and health kits at you like candy. It's just, here, have them. Tons of them. And so combat never poses a challenge to you, even when you're fighting what should be really powerful enemies, like Big Sisters. And it does throw some new enemies at you, like the Big Sisters, who are basically, imagine Big Daddies, only they are formed from little sisters who basically grown up and gone crazy. And so they're bouncing all over the place and hitting you with fireballs and stuff like that. It's pretty ridiculous, but again, nothing poses a threat. And so the combat ends up just being very tedious. And that's not something you want in a first-person shooter. Now, the original game had problems of seeming like it was scarce on ammo at times, and in fact it was. So it did heighten the challenge quite a bit, particularly when you played it on hard. Although you did still have the 1-2 punch with the shock and the wrench. But in this one, they throw so many things your way that you can't really fail. I never used a Vita chamber once in the entire game, and I had no problems with that. And by the end of the game, I had, I believe, 10 plasmid slots and a ludicrous number of gene tonic slots. So I had all sorts of bonuses going for me. Like, whenever I would hack machines, they would give me health and Eve, and I would get extra money and stuff like that from all these things that didn't pose a threat to me. And ultimately, the game ended up being pretty easy. And even though it was easy, it did last about 10 hours, even though it didn't really have to last 10 hours. I was mostly exploring everything and trying to find audio logs and stuff like that, trying to really experience the story and everything for what it was worth. And ultimately, the game just ends up being really disappointing in the single-player side of things. There's also multiplayer, which I didn't play. And part of that is because Games for Windows Live. I hate Games for Windows Live. Everyone hates Games for Windows Live. But it's pretty annoying in this one. But nobody plays the multiplayer anymore, so what's the point, right? So I didn't play the multiplayer in this one, and BioShock is mostly a single-player series anyway. But the whole problem I have with BioShock 2 is more that it was clearly a sequel just thrown together by 2K Marin to make money. They didn't really want to make a true sequel that really expanded upon the things that BioShock did well, and instead they decided, hey, we're going to make this cheap cash-in kind of thing and throw that out there. And it's not a bad game, but it just feels really cheap. It's cash-in. It doesn't feel like it fits in the series, or it doesn't really feel like it should exist. It doesn't really add anything to the BioShock license. It doesn't really add anything to gaming as a whole. It's just kind of there. And even though it does have its moments sometimes, which are kind of cool, it's just not a fun game. In fact, it's very tedious throughout most of it. So, ultimately, I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.